video is sponsored by Skillshare, who I want to give a huge thank you to for the generosity with which they've supported this channel in multiple videos throughout last year, and for the free trial links they've offered to you viewers. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in fields from fine art to marketing. With premium membership, you get unlimited access to quality classes from experts in their fields so you can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities, and do the work you love. Something I know so little about but wanted to explore and thought you might like are their classes on digital illustration with programs like Procreate, Illustrator, and Photoshop. Skillshare is an affordable learning platform with annual subscriptions for under $10 monthly, but through the link in my description, the first 500 people to sign up get a 2-month free trial with Skillshare. As always, I highly recommend you take advantage of a free offer for learning and just see if it's a valuable service to you. Thanks. Last minute housekeeping: if you would like to support this channel in any way or see more content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, following my social media links, and if you would like to, check out my Patreon or purchase this painting or ones like it on my website at robinsealark.com. Welcome to the tutorial. Today we are focusing on acrylic technique and creating the illusion of receding space in a landscape. We're talking perspective and 3-dimensional depth on a 2-dimensional surface. To keep everything organized, I decided to start this tutorial with an underdrawing. The underdrawing will demonstrate structural components to keep an awareness of while forming your image. To make sure that I didn't have a slanted horizon line, I measured down from the top of my image in 3 different spaces, equal distances. Then I lined up my ruler at the bottom of them and connected those dots. After that, we're creating a series of mountains along our horizon line. Because they are so far away, they're going to be very small. Something very important in creating images where you have a far receding space is making sure that you are flattening the shapes and creating more compact spaces. So a river that might be quite large is going to look very small and pushed together. Or the bottom of a surface like our marshlands is going to look a lot more flat in the distance than it is going to look up close. Be sure while you're doing this drawing, you're being aware of what these lines mean in terms of the actual structures they're representing. To give the marsh and grasslands some 3-dimensional depth, keep an awareness of the fact that you have the sides of our reeds showing as well as the tops of our reeds showing. And any place you draw the bottoms of the reeds is a place where they are connecting to the water. This river does wind throughout the entirety, moving forward in our composition, but because of the compactness of the space and creating this foreshortening of the landscape, there will be areas where we don't entirely express the existence of the river, but will allude to the existence of it when we do our shadowing with our acrylic paint. That's something you'll see more of further in our tutorial. Today we're going to be working with a very limited palette. You can see I'm using the primary colors, which are yellow, blue, and red, and I'll also have white and a little bit of black to create lights and shadowing. If you don't know, the primary colors are called that because you can use them to mix essentially any color, with the exception of more neon shades in which you might need to get something like a hot pink or a neon orange in order to create certain colors. The structure of my acrylic paintings usually works as such. I do my largest blocks of color with the least amount of details first, and then I move forward in layers, adding in more and more detail. I decided to start with our sky and then also our reflection of the sky on the water. The reason for this is because it's easiest to create a gradient when you are doing large sweeping horizontal movements with your paintbrush. So after we carefully go in to the area above our mountains and create that horizon line, then we're going to be able to go back in above that and move our brush back and forth in large sweeping movements to get a blending effect and create a very smooth color transition. Paramount to creating very smooth gradients with our acrylics is using the correct amount of water and the correct and appropriate sized paintbrush. So for this, I have a somewhat large paintbrush that fills a decent amount of our portion of space that I'm trying to make the gradient in. I would also suggest having a paintbrush that is somewhat flat versus a round tipped brush so that you can flatten the strokes of your paintbrush as you go back and forth. Now, out of the cropping of this image, the sky is actually fading up into a blue color. So as above, so below, we're going to end up having orange reflected down in the water and have that move into a more blue tone. Doing my gradients, I'm going to be working in multiple layers. The reason for this is because as you add liquid to your paint, it's going to become more translucent, meaning that you're going to see through the paint more. And in order to make it look very clean, I don't want any of my paper showing through. So I'm allowing different areas to dry and working on top of them to build up that opacity and make sure my image looks very clean and professional. The areas of the water closest to the horizon line are going to reflect the colors of the sky closest to the horizon line. So water furthest away from us by the mountain is going to be that darker orange, and water coming closer to your perspective as the viewer is going to be lighter, like the top peach of the sky, moving into that blue color that is out of frame in the sky. Something I like to do while creating gradients is to work on the top section of the gradient, then the bottom section of the gradient, then the middle. This becomes especially useful when I'm doing this bottom section of water because we are moving from more of an orange-yellow color into a blue. And to avoid having a large section of green reflected in the water, it's going to be useful to do these areas separately. The color paint that I'm using in common with the top lighter peachy yellow part of our gradient and the bottom light blue is a white paint. So when I have my clean brush and create these separate sections of color, when I meet them together in the middle, I can use a large amount of white paint to blend those two together seamlessly. Again, make sure you are using an appropriate amount of water, and that's going to be very key to creating smooth color transitions. Something I like to do is have a rag or paper towel next to me while I'm working, so that if I have too much water on my paintbrush, I can immediately dab it off and adjust. Over the next portion, you're going to be seeing me work layer after layer to build up the water gradient and the sky gradient. You may work differently with paint than I do. I'm very conservative in the way that I apply my paint. That's totally fine. You don't have to work the exact same way as I do. So if you need to, you can adjust some of the suggestions to your own methodology of painting. As I go up closer to the top of my sky portion, because it is slightly turning into this blue color, I am going to add in a very, very small amount of blue to my paint, but in degrees where we mostly have a peachy color with just a tinge of blue. By adding blue to an orange color, all that does is create a more muted or browner tone versus a more pungent or neon color. But because this is a glowing sunset, I'm going to want areas where I have punchier, more vibrant colors, and those are going to be more centered around the base of our horizon line. I decided to punch up some of the warmth and vibrancy of those colors by going in with a damp brush, using only yellow, and adding that back into our sunset. Something very important in creating realism is creating a correct amount of contrast. So don't be afraid to have variance in a very deep orange down by your mountaintops and a much lighter color near the top of the sky. Throughout this process of building up your layers, you can do some adjusting to make sure you have colors the exact way you want them. Add in more yellow tones to the top of that bluer section of water to make sure it's accurately reflecting the sky. Pay attention and just try to do an accurate reflection of how you think the water would be interacting with the sky above it. This next section I'm doing is blue, red, white, and we are creating our horizon line, the mountains. The mountains are such a dark color because our light source is behind them. Anytime you have a sunset or a sun behind an object you're painting, the foreground is going to be darker because the sun is either going to be hitting it from a backside or sideways angle. As you see with this one, these mountains in the far background are going to be one of the darker components of our image, and as you move forward, the tops of the grass will be hitting some of that warm orange light from the background. Right here is where I'm creating the sides of our grassy marshland. Because that is at a side angle to the sun, again, we're getting darker shadowing, and that's going to create some of the 3D object tangibility of these sections of grassland. Something very useful in making sure you do all of your gradation first before you go in with these top details is that it's very useful to create gradients by doing large sweeping horizontal motions. So if you have that already done, then you can work details on top of it that won't end up getting painted over while you're going in these back and forth motions. But while you do that, you may end up covering some of your underdrawing. So if you want to draw some of it back in before you end up painting, that is completely up to you. The next thing I'm doing is creating a blocked in section of our grassy areas. Now, what's most important isn't getting things exactly the right color or exactly the right texture yet. You're mostly just covering the paper and making sure you're building up your layers of paint so that you have a very opaque finished layer after you build up the texture of the grass. I like to start with a more foresty green that's a little bit dark so that we have the ability to work in shadows and highlights on top of it. But having a darker color underneath allows you to work lighter colors on top to have more individual grass blades that are picking up some of that sunset lit color that's coming across the landscape. It might seem a little counterintuitive to add red into your grasslands, but you do have a sky that is very orange, which means that the light hitting the grass is going to be tinged orange. Before I end up doing a lot of texturing with the grass, I'm going to create the side texture and structure of our grasslands to give them a 3D look. This is also where we're going to be defining the different structures of our grasslands. Because there's a foreshortening of the landscape, there are some areas where the water is not visible but present. By adding in shadows, that creates an illusion to where the water pathways run through the marshland. And I'll define those even more as we get to the end of the tutorial. Unlike with our gradients where we were doing long horizontal movements, our grass is more of a vertical movement. So you're going to be doing more flicks upward with your paintbrush, especially as you're putting in the sides of your marshland, defining where that grass is. You'll notice that it's only present on the left side, the areas where you see the side of the grass hitting the water. Based on our perspective as the viewer, you cannot see the side of the grass going into the water on the right side of that image. You can only see where the grass hits the water on the left side. That means when we create more detail work on the right side, we're going to be creating individual strokes of grass coming upwards, and we're only going to be doing the downward reflective grass blades on the left side of the painting. When you look at this, try to think of it somewhat like a sculpture. You're creating three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. So by having certain shading in certain places, you're indicating different structures of the land masses that are on top of that river. Remember, all the top areas where it's highest are going to be hit by that yellow-orange light, so you're going to be adding orange to your greens to create a warmth and a light on top of the grasslands. I create the grass in two different ways through building up layers. One way is by using larger brushes where the bristles are a little fanned. The other is in more individual defined detail where I go in with a smaller brush and create individual strokes and blades of grass. This creates a very detailed look, which also helps add to the less detailed texture of grass I create in some areas with the larger brushes. Now in this section, I decided to try to use an acrylic medium to create some glazing effects. I wanted to see if this would help. Sometimes with a wet brush, it can start to peel up previous layers of paint. So when you're doing glazing, you have to be wary of this. I don't know if it's the brand or just my lack of experience, but I didn't feel like I had less of this effect happen with the medium versus just using water. Right now, all I'm doing is creating a glaze, which is mostly a liquid like that medium or a water, and then some paint to add in warmth from the sunset, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, and creating a very see-through sheen of paint to add in warmer areas hitting the tops of the grass in the foreground. Foreground meaning what's closest to you. By adding this warmth of color to some of the grass, it increases the realism as that is the color of the light that is going to be hitting the tops of this grassland. You may want to do some cleaning up of your river. I decided to narrow even further the river in the background of my image to just further increase how distant it is from the viewer. And I also went in with small amounts of paint to add little details like small amounts of grass coming into the river. But the most important thing that I thought to do, and it was kind of a wild card, as I looked at this image, I noticed areas that it would be really nice to add back in little hints of where the river was flowing but was obstructed from view by mounds of the grassland. You can see the areas where I have that shadowing. That would indicate the side of a section of grass. So by placing little hints or glimmers of water at the base of those shadow areas, I get the effect that that is an obstructed area where you might see water more readily if you had a different vantage point as the viewer. These final details, cleaning up the edges of things, making sure your grass blades look very clean, that you have your shadowing, your contrast, your warmth, your vibrancy all in the place you want it to be, are really the transformative details that make a painting something very special. I liked this painting before I added in those little flecks of water, but when I added those in, I feel like it elevated this painting in a way that it just wasn't elevated before, and it made me like it so much more. So try to be aware of those details and know by adding that extra amount of patience and sitting with your painting that you're just going to give yourself an overall image that you like much more and looks much more professional. To finish off this painting, I took off our masking tape from the edges using a hairdryer on the hot setting. The heat from the air breaks the adhesive without ripping the paper, and once it's completely dry, I took it outside so that it would be a ventilated area and used a glossy spray varnish, though you can use something that you paint on in a liquid form. The glossy spray helps to amp up some of the contrast and deepen some of our darker areas so that the chalkiness of the acrylic won't flatten our darks. And ultimately, varnish helps to give a very polished, professional aesthetic, as well as protecting the overall image from damage. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I come out with new tutorials every month, so make sure you're subscribed. And if you would like to purchase this painting, you can do so at robinsealark.com.